Good evening and welcome to Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library for sponsoring this event and many of the events that take place in this library. If you're not familiar with the lineup of the events, please visit the nypl.org and click on the events limited to Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. Tonight's event is The Talented Miss Mandelbaum, The Rise and Fall of the American Organized Crime Boss. It is written by another talented lady, Miss Margalit Fox, considered to be one of the foremost explanatory writers and literary stylists in American journalism. Margalit Fox retired from New York Times obituary writing in 2018. As a member of the newspaper's celebrated obituary department, she has written page one send-offs for some of the best-known cultural figures of our era, including the pioneering feminist Betty Friedan and Toni Morrison, Adrienne Rich, the children's author Maurice Sendak, and Dear Abby and Ann Landers, advice columnists. She's also written obituaries for many of the unsung heroes who have managed quietly to touch history, among them the inventor of the crash test dummy, the barcode, and the pink plastic lawn flamingo. In 2016, the Poynter Institute named her one of the best writers of New York Times in history, the recipient of William Sarayan International Prize for Nonfiction. Margalit is the author of 4 previous narrative nonfiction books: Talking Heads, The Riddle of the Labyrinth, Conan Doyle for the Defense, and The Confidence Men. Originally trained as a cellist, she holds bachelor's and master's degrees in linguistics and a master's degree from Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Without any further ado, please welcome the talented Margalit Fox.
Thank you, Mariana, and thank you to the staff, our tech support people, my new best friends, and thank you all so much for coming. So, if I were to tell you that I'd written the true story of America's first great organized crime boss, you would almost certainly picture a large, unpleasant man with spats and pinstripes and an all-important Tommy gun during Prohibition. Of course you would. That's what I pictured. That's what we all pictured for years and years. However, it transpires that the first major organized crime boss in America was actually a nice Jewish mother named Mrs. Mandelbaum. So we have a lovely hour to spend together. Let me tell you very briefly how our time will be structured. I'm going to begin with a reading of about 5 minutes from The Talented Mrs. Mandelbaum, just to give you all a sense of this astonishing real-life woman and the opulent world she made. After that, I'll talk for about 35 minutes about who she was and how, against overwhelming odds and by a quite unorthodox route, she was able to rise from tenement poverty to Gilded Age splendor. After that, we will throw the floor open to your questions, and after that, there will be a stampede to get books for me to sign. But before we do any of those things, I'm going to begin in true pedagogical fashion by showing you a movie that is exactly 1 minute long. This is the book trailer for The Talented Mrs. Mandelbaum, made by a supremely talented filmmaker friend. And what's especially interesting about this trailer is that it posed some rather serious craft challenges for the filmmaker, because the entire narrative of the talented Mrs. Mandelbaum takes place before the advent of cinema. The conventional date for the invention of cinema is 1895. Dafka Frederica Mandelbaum died in 1894. But somehow a filmmaker has to translate this real-life story onto video. So let's take a look now at how my friend, the documentarian Vanessa Gould, brilliantly solved that problem. In 1850, Frederica Mandelbaum came to New York in steerage and worked as a peddler on the streets of Lower Manhattan. Before long, she had transformed herself into a philanthropist, a society hostess, and boss of the country's most notorious crime syndicate, half a century before the heyday of organized crime. Jewel heists, bank robberies, chutzpah. This is her story. So, now that you've met Mrs. Mandelbaum, you are all invited to come with me to her home, and I promise you'll be quite safe. The place is right here in Manhattan. The time is the summer of 1884. I'm going to read to you now from the prologue to the book, which is titled A Glittering Hoard. They were detectives accustomed to plunder, but they'd never seen anything like this. It had taken some doing to open the safe. After bursting into the modest haberdashery shop on Manhattan's Lower East Side, they demanded the keys from the shopkeeper, Frederica Mandelbaum. But Mrs. Mandelbaum, a towering woman of 59, tastefully attired in diamond cluster earrings and a lace-trimmed gown of dotted blue, held firm. "No," she declared in her heavy Germanic English, "just to think of such a thing." Her refusal forced the detectives, employees of the storied Pinkerton agency, to become safecrackers themselves. They summoned a blacksmith who arrived at the shop with hammer and chisel. He attacked the safe. Amid the din, a pretty teenage girl ran in from the next room, Mrs. Mandelbaum's daughter, Annie. "Stop!" Annie cried. She handed over the keys, and the safe was unlocked. An Aladdin's cave spilled out. There were gems and jewelry of every description, rings, chains, scarf pins, bracelets, glittering cufflinks and collar buttons, almost every ornament you could mention, one detective recalled. Beside them were heaps of gold watches and, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, watch movements and cases. There was a clutch of fine silverware. There were loose diamonds the size of peas. Elsewhere, in the shop's clandestine back rooms, protected by a metal grill and linked to the outdoors by a set of secret passages, the detectives came upon priceless antique furniture, a trunk brimming with shawls of the finest cashmere and curtains of exquisite lace, and bolts of silk worth thousands of dollars alone. Concealed under newspapers were bars of gold fashioned from melted down jewelry. Upstairs in Mrs. Mandelbaum's gracious bedroom, they found melting pots and scales for weighing gold and diamonds. She and an employee were promptly arrested. With that, the Pinkerton detectives, who had staged the raid at the behest of the city's district attorney, accomplished in a single outing what New York's police force had not managed to do in more than 20 years. You are caught this time, and the best thing that you can do is to make a clean breast of it. One of the Pinkertons, Gustav Frank, advised Mrs. Mandelbaum as she was led away. In reply, Frederica Mandelbaum, upright widow, philanthropic synagogue goer, doting mother of 4, and boss of the country's most notorious crime syndicate, whirled and punched him in the face. For 25 years, Frederica Mandelbaum reigned as one of the most infamous underworld figures in America. Working from her humble Manhattan storefront, she presided over a multi-million-dollar criminal operation that centered on stolen luxury goods and later diversified into bank robbery. Conceived in the mid-1800s, long before the accepted starting date for organized crime in the United States, her empire extended across the country and beyond. In 1884, the New York Times called her, quote, the nucleus and center of the whole organization of crime. Revered in some quarters, reviled in others, Marm Mandelbaum, as she was known, towered over the city as an earthy, expansive, diamond-encrusted presence, self-made entrepreneur, generous philanthropist, thieves' mentor, and gracious society hostess who plied her illicit trade largely in the open. A swath of the public admired her. Many criminals adored her. Over the course of her long, lucrative career, she would spend scarcely a day behind bars. Late 19th century newspapers reveled in Marm's doings and liked to say that she could unload anything, including, in one account, a flock of stolen sheep. But it is beyond doubt that by the mid-1880s, as much as $10 million, about $300 million in today's money, had passed through her little haberdashery shop on the Lower East Side. The story of her rise to underworld stardom is a window onto a little explored side of Gilded Age America, the world of Herbert Asbury's Gangs of New York, from the perspective of a sharp-witted, fiercely determined woman. Some modern observers have called Mrs. Mandelbaum a proto-feminist. Perhaps she was, though she appeared as committed to wifely and maternal duties as any woman of her era. What can be said with certainty is that she was among the first, quite possibly the very first, to systematize the formerly scattershot enterprise of property crime, working out logistics, organizing chains of supply and demand, and constructing the whole venture first and foremost as a business. And in so doing, she simultaneously embodied and upended the cherished rags-to-riches narrative of Victorian America, starring on entirely her own terms in a Horatio Alger story of a very different kind. And so ends our preface. Now, I first became aware of Frederica Mandelbaum several years ago because she was always there for the taking, yet in a certain tantalizing way also not there, seemingly unknowable, a ghost. Although Marm Mandelbaum gets passing mentions in a great many books on New York City history, there are very few extended treatments of her life and work. But even what little I was able to read caused her to seize hold of me, and me to seize hold of her in return. What tantalized me above all was a single fundamental question. How could this be? How could a woman, a penniless, immigrant, Jewish woman, have risen to become a pillar of her community, an admired philanthropist, and a sought-after society hostess? Here she is at one of her famous dinner parties, all because she had simultaneously risen to become the head of the most successful and the most notorious crime syndicate in America. How could she have amassed a personal fortune of as much as $1 million, the equivalent of some 20 million today? And all this more than half a century before Prohibition, the widely accepted starting date for organized crime in America, an era in which women, if they figured at all, were little more than the peroxide blondes on the gangster's arm. Now, two other things about Frederica Mandelbaum struck me right away. First, that she ran her criminal empire largely in the open, and during her 25-year reign, didn't spend even a single day in jail. And second, that unlike the male mobsters who came after her, she pursued non-violent crime. She made her fortune as a receiver of stolen goods, a fence, to use the colloquial term, covertly buying, cleverly disguising, and quietly reselling a welter of luxury items, all of them expertly purloined for her by the cadre of foot soldiers at her beck and call. So what is it exactly that a fence does? Now, you all look like fine, upstanding citizens, well, most of you, so I'm going to give everyone the benefit of the doubt and assume no one knows. Naughty, naughty. A fence, quite simply, converts plunder into cash. As long as there have been robbers, there have been receivers of stolen goods. For while a robber may be really good at stealing stuff, he rarely has the contacts, the time, or the social finesse to sell his wares onward for a good profit. So that is where the fence comes in. There were generations of fences before Mrs. Mandelbaum, and there have been generations after, right up to today. But what she did had by all accounts not been done so systematically or so well before. She took the haphazard, disorganized business of property crime and streamlined it into a well-oiled underworld corporate machine, presiding over an army of shoplifters, housebreakers, and jewel thieves. She masterminded robberies of gold, silver, silk, and diamonds. Before long, she was also masterminding bank robberies. Frederica Mandelbaum literally towered over her era. She was reported to have stood almost 6 feet tall and weighed nearly 300 pounds. Pouchy-faced and apple-cheeked, she resembled nothing so much, as I had the pleasure of writing, as the product of a congenial liaison between a dumpling and a mountain. Many of her contemporaries venerated her as a kind of Robin Hood figure. She robbed from the rich and gave, or rather sold at below wholesale prices to the country's new, upwardly mobile middle class. Mrs. Mandelbaum was also venerated as a den mother to the American underworld. She wined and dined her foot soldiers at the groaning table we saw in her opulent Lower East Side home. She supplied bail money when they were arrested And my favorite thing of all, she furnished getaway horses and carriages whenever they had to flee genteelly the scene of a crime. For the maternal care and feeding that she lavished on her employees, as well as on her own 4 children, criminals and the press called her Mother, Ma, or Marm Mandelbaum. In her day, Marm Mandelbaum was literally world famous, the subject of newspaper articles, editorial cartoons, and even a couple of stage plays. And wonderfully, we know for a fact that she went to see this play dressed in her fabulous diamonds and silk and was absolutely incensed, not at the fact that she was being portrayed on stage as a criminal. That was totally fine. But at how frumpily her character was costumed. So incensed, in fact, that she summoned the manager of the theater and gave him a good tongue lashing. But over time, like so many of history's women, Frederica Mandelbaum was largely lost to public memory. And so, as I embarked on my journey in search of her, I realized that I would have to piece together, clue by tiny historical clue, the riddle of what had made her career possible in the first place. Now, when you write historical nonfiction, as I do, your first port of call is always to the archive of personal papers that your subject has thoughtfully left behind for posterity. In Mrs. Mandelbaum's case, there weren't any. Frederica Mandelbaum was nobody's fool. She clearly knew that in her line of work, committing anything to paper would be professional suicide. And so, for more than a year, I sifted the widely scattered, atomized records of the past in search of glimmers of her life. Take a look. And what you see on the screen is perhaps 1% of the total. So as you can imagine, it was an intense, sometimes frustrating, but nearly always pleasurable process that felt a lot like panning for gold. And here is one of the nuggets that surfaced, her actual indictment from 1884, when the law finally began to close in. And in the end, when I'd amassed enough of these little flashes to be able to join them all together, what they revealed illuminated not only Mrs. Mandelbaum and her era, but also in ways I could scarcely have anticipated when I began this work 3 or 4 years ago, the America of our own time. Frederica Mandelbaum was 25 years old when she came to New York in 1850. She had been born Friederike Weisner in Kassel, in what is now central Germany, one of 7 children in a family of threadbare Jewish peddlers. At 23, she married Wolf Israel Mandelbaum, also a peddler. Their first child, Bertha, was born the next year. If the Mandelbaums were to remain in the old country, a future of unremitting hardship was assured. Jews in German lands were subject to restrictions on the trades they could ply and the areas in which they could live, which by extension restricted whom they could marry. They sometimes met with violence at the hands of Gentile neighbors. In addition, the region was beset by a severe economic depression and, as in Ireland, a potato famine. In 1850, the Mandelbaums joined thousands of others from the region in emigrating to America in search of a better life. Wolf left first with Frederica and baby Berta following behind. Mother and daughter made the Atlantic crossing not by steam, but by sail, a voyage of 6 weeks or more below deck in steerage, dark, cramped, malodorous, filthy. In New York, the Mandelbaums settled on the Lower East Side in an area known as Klein Deutschland, Little Germany, one of America's first major immigrant enclaves. They lived there in abject poverty in a series of shabby, overcrowded tenements without running water or sanitation facilities of any kind. This is a Jacob Riis photograph. Factories and slaughterhouses stood side by side with residential buildings. The streets were strewn with garbage, snapped at by bands of roaming pigs. Backyards were filled with sewage from overflowing communal outhouses. And there, amid the unhygienic conditions, the infant Berta Mandelbaum died. It is virtually certain that she succumbed to one of the contagious diseases, typhoid, cholera, consumption, that ran through the tenements like urban brush fires. And yet, this was the start of the era that would be called the Gilded Age. Uptown, the privileged few, titans of industry like Astors, Vanderbilts, and Rockefellers were erecting their mansions, marble palaces awash in gold and silk and old master paintings. Downtown, the many, thousands of immigrants like the Mandelbaums were simply trying to survive. But how could they survive? Then, as now, immigrants endured discrimination and disenfranchisement of the worst kind. The jobs available to them were overwhelmingly dangerous, demeaning, and low-paying. A man might be hired to dig ditches, haul bricks and mortar on his shoulders, or load ship's cargo on the waterfront. There was no occupational safety. Workers could be injured or killed falling from building sites or crushed by wayward cargo. When bad weather precluded outdoor work, there was no pay. For immigrant women, job prospects were even more dire, confined mostly to domestic service. A woman might be hired as a live-in housekeeper, a position entailing back-breaking labor of 16 hours a day for little more than room, board, and $1 a week. As a result, whether in bold self-determination or desperate last resort, some immigrants turned to illicit activity, climbing the so-called crooked ladder to provide for their families. But strikingly, even in the underworld, there turned out to be far more job opportunities for men than for women. Men could become fences. They could run numbers rackets or illegal gambling joints. They could work as hired muscle or help get out the vote for the Tammany Hall machine. But for women, there were pretty much only two choices: shoplifting, and you all know what's coming, prostitution. Shoplifting was so small time that it virtually guaranteed a woman would remain in penury. Prostitution virtually guaranteed that she would die young. In the New York of Mrs. Mandelbaum's day, the average life expectancy for a woman entering the trade was 4 years. Now, for a proper married woman like Frederica Mandelbaum, prostitution was clearly off the table. But it's also clear that she was absolutely determined not to remain in poverty. As I researched Frederica's story, one of the things that struck me was that at bottom, it's about entrepreneurship. I'd known going in, of course, that it was a historical true crime tale and also a largely forgotten slice of women's history, but I hadn't quite realized that it's also a business story. And what's especially striking about the business aspect of this story is how closely Frederica's step-by-step rise as an underworld entrepreneur paralleled the rise of entrepreneurs in the so-called upper world, the realm of legitimate commerce. For instance, just as you can't walk into a corporate headquarters with the ink still wet on your MBA and be named the chief executive, you can't start out in organized crime by becoming a boss. In both cases, you start at the bottom and you work your way up. And that, in the 1850s, is exactly what Frederica Mandelbaum began to do. After the Mandelbaums settled on the Lower East Side, Frederica's husband, Wolf, resumed his work as a peddler. Frederica also began peddling, selling lace door to door in streets already thronged with men, women, and young children hawking everything from shoes, cheap jewelry, and fiddle strings to oysters, hot corn, and apple pie. And you can see from the sheer density of this image that for any one peddler, the odds against being able to sell enough to keep body and soul together were absolutely overwhelming. Now, Frederica could easily have been trapped in that life forever, but we know from what followed that she recognized something crucial very early, that it was the accrual of capital rather than wage work that would be her ticket out of poverty. To make that leap, as she knew, she would have to quit peddling and strike out on her own as a solo entrepreneur. But without any startup capital, how could she even begin? For a woman as smart and determined as she, the answer was clear. By looking around and seeing exactly what it was that the public wanted to buy, but not pay full price for. Mrs. Mandelbaum had the good fortune to have arrived in New York amid an explosion of stuff and a corresponding explosion of desire. Thanks to industrialization, urbanization, and the rise of professional work, a new American middle class had emerged. At the same time, mass production was making an immense array of consumer goods more widely available than ever, and newspapers and magazines of the period lost no time in fanning the flames of middle-class cupidity with advertisements like these. That's my favorite one. So where Americans had once been merely purchasers, all of a sudden they were now consumers, under immense pressure to keep up with the Joneses by transforming their homes into showplaces of modern material culture, awash in fine furniture, paintings, carpets, curtains, decorative lamps, knickknacks, bric-a-brac, and every kind of fancy tchotchke. Well, even a middle-class family couldn't afford all those things. Not at full price, anyhow. But as these new bourgeois men and women quickly discovered, they could solve the problem handily through clandestine visits to their friendly neighborhood fence. And so Mrs. Mandelbaum began to capitalize, literally capitalize, by filling the gap in the market that she had discerned at the nexus of thrift, stuff, class, and desire. During her first decade in America, she began handling goods brought to her furtively by Lower East Side pickpockets and petty thieves. She asked no questions about provenance and quickly turned round and resold the swag at a profit. By the end of that decade, around 1859, she had amassed enough capital to forsake peddling entirely and set herself up as a full-time entrepreneur. Friederike Mandelbaum had become a professional fence. For Mrs. Mandelbaum, the economics of a transaction worked in this way. Suppose you are a thief and you bring me, Mother Mandelbaum, a handsome gold watch. I don't know where it came from, and I don't want to know. But what I do know, and know well, is the market. I have the wholesale price of every article I handle burned into my brain. So on receiving the watch, I pay you, the thief, 10 to 25% of its wholesale value, leaving me an enormous margin. You then exit the equation entirely, bye, and in relative safety, too. And this is crucial, because part of my job is to serve as a layer of protective insulation between the thief and the police. And in fact, the word fence in this meaning is simply a truncation of the word defense, spelled in the British way with a C. Next, after I eradicate any identifying marks on the watch, I consult my memorized list of private customers, see who's in the market for a handsome gold timepiece, and quietly sell it on. I charge the customer half to 2/3 of wholesale, giving him an excellent bargain and myself an excellent net profit. Now, this very simple business model served Mother Mandelbaum brilliantly throughout her working life. And while she would buy and resell almost anything of value, one 19th century newspaper article reported that she once resold 50,000 stolen cigars. Like any good business person, she specialized in certain product lines. Throughout her 25-year run as a criminal receiver, Mrs. Mandelbaum concentrated on two things in particular: silk and diamonds. Now, I'm going to go all Socratic for a minute, because that's my prerogative, and I want all of you to take just a moment to consider those two choices. Out of the hundreds and hundreds of consumer goods flooding mid-19th century America, why those two things, silk and diamonds in particular? So take a quick second to chew on it, and then go ahead and raise your hand if you think you have the answer. This lady. A display of wealth and prominence. You're getting warmer. Gentleman on the aisle, or person on the aisle. Sorry, I can't see. That's part of it. You're getting warmer. The prize, by the way, next. You're all getting warm. None of you win the prize. The prize, by the way, is 50,000 stolen cigars, so probably just as well. All of you are right, but there's one even more crucial thing. Now you're getting somewhere. For Mrs. Mandelbaum, specializing in silk and diamonds was an eminently sound business decision, because indeed, both of those commodities have huge value relative to their weight. By the 1860s, she was moving up in the underworld, and her crew had diversified, gentrified really, from scruffy local pickpockets to some of America's most accomplished housebreakers, store burglars, and jewel thieves. And here comes her actual crew, and I want you to notice the range of ethnicities of the last names of these crooks, Frederica was our original DEI employer. So in order to make their assignments as safe and as cost-effective as possible, she, as their boss, would need to direct them to steal things that could be lifted imperceptibly, as someone said, absconded with quickly, but which even in small quantities would yield maximum profit. Under Marm's direction, the women in her organization were in charge of the small, high-value items, and they set happily to work lifting things like silk scarves, kid gloves, cashmere shawls, and jewelry from the new, well-lighted mercantile pleasure palaces that would soon be known as department stores. Her male employees got the heftier assignments, including lifting heavy bolts of silk in quantity from warehouses and waterfront docks. But it would take one last major change in American material culture for Mother Mandelbaum to bring into her organization the most daring crooks of all, the bank burglars. Movies and TV have given us the sense that heisting banks was always a going concern in America, but not so. In fact, until the 1860s, bank burglary and safecracking were relatively rare. And the reason for this harks back to the colonial period. In the 17th and 18th centuries, each of the 13 colonies issued its own paper money at some point, but all of it was very crudely printed and therefore very easily counterfeited. Take a look. It's lovely, but it's simple, and we have to make a special apologies to Benjamin Franklin, who printed the one on the lower right. Sorry, Ben, we love you for many other reasons, but a 6-year-old could copy this. As a result, when American independence came along, the framers of the Constitution, acutely aware of this problem, empowered Congress to coin money, but made no provision whatsoever for printing it. And so, for the nation's first 3/4 of a century, gold and silver were literally coin of the realm. Now, that's fine for most of us, but imagine that you are an ambitious young man longing to make your mark by separating a bank from its contents. So you go heist a mess of gold, and then what? You then have to go clanking heavily and loudly down the street. Not good for business. So as a result, criminals actually gave banks a fairly wide berth. But then came the Civil War, and with it, the Union's urgent need to raise the money to wage it. In the early 1860s, President Lincoln empowered the government to issue fiat money, paper tender that was backed not by gold or silver, but simply by the government's word. By the mid-1860s, the government had issued nearly $500 million in this paper money, equivalent to almost $9 billion today. And you can see reproduction, 19th century money here, a still from our trailer, and you can see from my hand in shot the scale of the bills. They were enormous, and I will have a stack of reproduction 19th century money out on the book table, and people are welcome to help themselves to it. It has no value. But in the underworld, there was much rejoicing. Now remember Mother Mandelbaum's golden rule. You go after stuff that has great value relative to weight. Well, paper money, by its very nature, has that in spades. And so for Mrs. Mandelbaum, the way forward was clear. The time had come to heist a bank or two. She gathered around her some of the country's foremost burglars, men who had cut their teeth plundering the stately homes and fancy shops of America. Under her direction, they chose the most opportune banks to burgle, plotted the best means of entry, and surveilled the bank and surrounding neighborhood, a process of planning, revision, and rehearsal that could take months or even years. Like an angel investing in a Broadway show, Mother Mandelbaum underwrote their expenses, spending thousands to have bespoke sets of the latest burglar's tools, custom made. Now, there are 3 major bank burglaries recounted in The Talented Mrs. Mandelbaum, but we have time tonight for me to tell you only that they could be hugely profitable, netting hundreds of thousands of dollars, that's 19th century dollars, each time. Marm Mandelbaum was reported to get as much as 50% of the take. And here's one of her boys crawling through the wall toward the bank vault. But then, after 25 lucrative years, Mrs. Mandelbaum's reign as a crime boss drew to a close. American culture had changed. Increasingly, urban politics was controlled not by scrappy, up-from-your-bootstraps immigrants, but by native-born, Ivy League-educated WASP patricians. And in that climate, a brazen, female, Jewish immigrant who unabashedly did not know her place had no place. And so, in the mid-1880s, the forces of the law began conspiring to bring her down. After the Pinkertons raided her shop in 1884, Mrs. Mandelbaum was arrested, indicted, and scheduled to stand trial on multiple counts of grand larceny. But then, in a dazzling 11th-hour act of self-preservation, she pulled off one last caper worthy of a rogue of her stature. And so, as a direct result of that caper, our heroine, Frederica Mandelbaum, wily as ever, was actually able to I could tell you what happened next, of course. I could also tell you how to figure out the combination to a bank vault, assuming you're living in the 19th century, how to steal diamonds from Tiffany and Company, ditto, and above all, the answer to the question that seized hold of me that very first day. How in the world a nice Jewish mother could preside for a quarter century over the most notorious crime syndicate in America. But if I told you, you know the rest. Let's just say that would be cheating. And unlike our remarkable real-life heroine, I am no cheat. So instead, I will say only, thank you all so much for listening, and I'll be delighted to take your questions. Someone's coming around. People are coming around with microphones.
Just curious if the house that she was living in, is that still there on the Lower East Side?
Sadly not. There's another building there now. Her building, she eventually bought her whole building and lived in Palace of Versailles-like splendor on the upper floors. That building was made of wood, and by probably the 1920s it was gone. So there's just a brick building there now, sadly not hers.
You know the address? What's the address?
It's in the book. It's
Okay.
Clinton and Rivington, and because it was on the corner, there's a different, it has 2 street numbers, one for each street.
If you think that the thieves in the Louvre took a page from her entrepreneurship, the jewels that were stolen in the Louvre were stolen for the exact same reason. Because you can melt the gold, and the jewels that were stolen also from the Cairo Museum, and you know Egypt had a lot of gold, were stolen for the same reason. They now steal gold, and that's jewelry, because it's easier to flog. Art, you can't. Paintings, everybody knows. But this we'll never see, and it's like 22 million euros.
That's
and we'll never
exactly
see
right.
them again.
And in fact, without giving too much away, in Mrs. Mandelbaum's establishment on the Lower East Side, she had a room where a group of immigrant German artisans who had been things like silversmiths and engravers in the old country would efface the engravings on stolen watches and jewelry and draw another engraving over it so you couldn't read the owner's name.
So just a quick question. Did she stumble in even your research, fortune tellers? That was another opportunity for women in 1850, 1860. Did she have any, and in the East Village as well, like Mortimer and the Witches, if you know that book?
I did not come across it, and I think the rise of spiritualism in this country and the spiritualist charlatans that jumped onto that bandwagon came a little later. That was more late Victorian, and then for obvious reasons it had a resurgence during World War I when so many people had lost family members. So I did not find any dovetailing of this sort of more hard-edged, large-scale mercenary crime that she did with fortune tellers. That's really interesting, though.
I was interested. You had the drawing of the dinner table, and I was interested if you could talk a little bit. When you use the phrase philanthropist, just fill in a little of the kind of social world that she was working in. Who was sitting at that table?
Well, it's in the book. That's a wonderful question, and without creating too many spoilers for myself, because it's a business story, after all. I need to make a living. I don't do it quite the same way that she did. There were luminaries and the creme de la creme of two different parallel strata of Gilded Age life. One was the nation's foremost bank burglars and jewel thieves, all in evening dress. So according to some stories, they might be, stealing one another's watches, between dinner and dessert. But then down the other side of the table, in evening dress, laughing and telling jokes and drinking wine with the crooks, were some of the biggest figures in the so-called upper world, the bankers, the brokers, the politicians. And really, as you'll see from the book, what's the difference? One brand of commerce was deemed illegal, one was not. But right, and I will say only that, again, it is explained fully in the book why she could stay out of jail. She took the dictum, "The policeman is your friend," to very pragmatic and very lucrative extremes.
Okay, I kind of have two questions. One, what was her family's response? Oh, I'm over here. What was her family's response? Because I remember you leading with the scene where it's her daughter who's just open the safe, and I remember much mentioning of her husband. What was his thoughts?
Well, let me get to the children first. After she lost her infant daughter, she had 4 children who lived at least to young adulthood, 2 sons and 2 daughters. And what absolutely tickles me was, again, she was an echt 19th century business person businessmen in legitimate commerce. She brought the boys into her business, but not the girls. As for the husband, Wolf, I think they very much had a don't ask, don't tell stance in their marriage with regard to what was going on. There's a wonderful memoir by a man with a wonderful name, George Washington Walling, who was chief of police in New York during Mrs. Mandelbaum's heyday, and he knew her well. Contemplating the Mandelbaums as a couple, he had this to say, and the quote is so wonderful, it's burned into my brain. He said, "The woman took the lead in these nefarious transactions. She was a thorough businesswoman. Her husband was a non-entity. He was a nebbish." And Wolf died probably of consumption in the 1870s, so leaving her then to really do anything she wanted as in support of her family.
So was her escape entirely her own? Was when she disappeared, was her family disappearing with her? Or
Well, again, I could tell you, but etc. But I can recommend a reasonably good book where you can find the answer to that question.
Hi. Yeah, so growing up in the 80s, it's interesting to see that, I was thinking, I don't have a question, I'm just more of a statement, but it's interesting to see that the reputation of Delancey Street precedes it way further. Because, growing up in the 80s, it's like that was the area where a lot of things were fenced. And it's like to see it like, oh my God, it goes way back then. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly our contemporaries did not invent any of that stuff, and it was certainly alive and well and thriving down on the Lower East Side. And of course, remember, the city in those years really stopped at about 14th Street. So, the what we now call the Lower East Side was right smack in the center of things at that time.
I was wondering how long this project took you from the first time you heard about it till the publication of the book.
My previous book came out in 2021, and so I would have started researching at least the proposal for this book around that time. And like as with all my books, I spend the first 12 to, in this case, 18 months just reading the literature before I even touch the keyboard. The writing, by comparison, was quick. That was maybe another 9 months. So start to finish, a little over 2 years, 2.5 years. And then it was published in hardcover in 2024. So nothing in the world of book publishing happens quickly, and time is measured in years at best.
Will it be made into a movie?
I'm glad you asked. I've just signed a development deal with a production company for what we all agree should be a TV series, whether limited or ongoing, we don't know. But as a producer I spoke to so rightly said, it shouldn't just be a 2-hour feature film, one and done. It has to be a series because people will want to continue to live in that world. And I couldn't agree more.
Thank you very much for coming. I'm sorry we ran out of time.